Chapter 1: Routine Maintenance. The artificial sun of his crew quarters began its programmed ascent, a slow, deliberate brightening that mimicked dawn but offered none of its warmth. Jax opened his eyes, the metallic tang of recycled air filling his lungs. It was 0600, ship standard time, a start to a day identical to the last one and the one before it. He rose from the narrow cot, his joints clicking a familiar protest. His body had long since adjusted to the ship's artificial gravity, but the constant vibration still left a subtle ache in his bones, a feeling as predictable as the daily cycle. He moved with a practiced efficiency, pulling on his clean coveralls, the fabric stiff and unscented. The garment was functional, devoid of any personality or style, just like the man wearing it. He didn't bother to look at himself on the small, circular mirror that sat on the side of the wall. There was nothing to see that he hadn't already memorized, a face as familiar as the hum of the ship itself. He squeezed a tube of nutrient paste onto a small spoon, its flavor a bland imitation of something vaguely edible. It offered sustenance without pleasure, the epitome of efficiency that permeated every aspect of his life aboard the Stardust Wanderer. The routine, much like the food, was designed to keep things going without the unnecessary distraction of actual enjoyment. He swallowed the tasteless mass, the texture familiar, like chewed paper, and quickly left the small cubicle of his crew quarters, his boots echoing softly on the sterile metal floor. The hallways of this lower tier felt colder than the climate control implied, and there was something almost desperate in the clean and clinical design. The same white walls, the same metal railings, the same soft lights. It all looked almost alien to him, even after all this time. Maintenance Level 3, Section Delta, was already a symphony of mechanical sounds when he entered. The air smelled of lubricant, ozone, and heated metal, a smell he had come to associate with this specific routine. Jax retrieved his assigned tablet from its charging station, the screen displaying the day's maintenance schedule, a monotonous list of systems checks, sensor calibrations, and routine repairs. His fingers danced across the screen with a familiarity that felt both natural and also alien to him. He tapped a few icons, and the soft whir of the data connection filled his ears. His round started as usual, the first a careful inspection of the coolant system's distribution nodes. He touched the cold metal casing with his bare hand, the vibration a familiar pulse beneath his calloused skin. His eyes scanned the monitors, his ears attuned to the subtle variations in the machine's hum. A minor fluctuation in pressure here, a slightly elevated temperature there. He noted them on his tablet, entering precise measurements with the kind of practiced ease that came with years of repetition. There was a moment where his mind drifted away, thinking about the absurdity of his job, tending to machines that were in turn, tending to a system that took very little effort from his part to actually maintain. All of this mechanical hum and purpose, for no actual purpose at all. He was like a single cog within a machine whose only goal was to move without any aim, or a soul. Jax shook his head softly, trying to focus once more on the blinking lights. This system in particular took a certain focus. The Stardust Wanderer, he knew, relied upon the smooth operation of its temperature controls. He moved from one node to another, his footsteps methodical and unwavering. This section was quite dark, and there was an almost claustrophobic quality to the area, even for someone who felt as comfortable as him within the cold metal veins of the ship. Jax felt that sometimes the ship was more alive than him, a breathing beast of metal and plastic that, despite its gigantic size, moved with such a singular, mechanical purpose that he felt completely dwarfed in comparison, and almost obsolete. The absurdity of his efforts filled his mind. What was it all for, these constant calibrations, the precise measurements? His purpose was almost entirely automated, his presence here almost entirely obsolete. What was he even doing here? The question bounced around his skull, like a faulty engine part banging around, demanding attention but never being heard. He didn't belong. He wasn't even a great engineer, not anymore. He had spent most of his professional life improving his designs, moving upwards towards new and exciting innovations. Back in the station, before everything, before asterisk her asterisk, he had purpose. Here in the Stardust, he was just a simple maintenance man that could easily be replaced by another cog of the machine. A small thought that came often enough that he had, in a weird way, gotten used to it. The thought was as monotonous as his days. Enya entered the bay with her usual, quiet steps, her boots making soft thumps on the grated floor. Her movements were not rushed, and always with a natural grace that defied her age, almost as if the ship moved around her. Elias followed closely behind, a bounce in his gait that spoke of youthful energy. Enya's salt and pepper hair was barely visible under her work cap. She gave Jax a slight nod, a silent acknowledgement as she made her way to her assigned station. Her gaze lingered on Jax for a moment, a knowing look that seemed to see more than his tired eyes wanted to show. Elias, unable to contain his usual enthusiasm, practically bounced in his position, his face glowing with the eagerness of someone who hadn't yet been defeated by the ship's monotony. "Jax," Elias called, his voice echoing around the large, mostly empty maintenance bay. "I was thinking about the coolant distribution system, and what if—" Jax ignored him, pretending to be fully invested in the temperature output of a nearby panel. He had learned long ago that engaging Elias on his latest theoretical breakthrough was a fool's game. It always resulted in at least 20 minutes of very complicated explanations about systems that worked well enough, or an hour-long rant about the old ways of the previous teams of engineers. It was easier to pretend he was not listening. Enya's quiet smile lingered as she set up her workstation next to Jax's, seemingly amused by the contrast. She seemed to find comfort in watching Elias' zealous approach, a nostalgic smile barely noticeable under her lined eyes. Jax, however, felt nothing. He never did, not since his old life had become a distant, fading photograph. He turned his attention to the gravity regulators, a crucial system that required both precision and focus. The task itself was almost meditative, connecting diagnostic cables, adjusting dials, and interpreting data flows until finally everything looked as it should. His movements were quick, trained from muscle memory that felt, at times, older than his own years. As he worked, his mind wandered. A memory surfaced, the bustling control room of the old space station, the excited chatter of his colleagues, the energy that once coursed through his veins. There were screens that showed live feeds of the galaxy around them, people that spoke of the future, children laughing and playing. All of it now, nothing but ghosts within the corridors of his memories. He glanced down at the tablet screen, its glossy surface reflecting the sterile light of the maintenance bay. He had never changed the background image of the device from the time he joined the Wanderer's crew, despite that being years ago now. The picture displayed an older station that looked, by the standards of the Wanderer, a relic. It was full of colors, both in its physical structure and in the people that occupied it. He could see his younger self there, full of life, his wife, radiant with hope, and a small child, smiling straight at the camera. The memories, once sharp, were beginning to lose focus, just as his image had lost its vibrant colors, and had been replaced by a pale echo that could barely recognize itself within the mirror. Jax closed the screen quickly, his chest tightening, the dull ache in his heart rising to a low pulse, matching the rhythm of the machinery around him. He needed to focus. He needed to work. The shift continued with each mechanic absorbed in their duties. The only sounds were the hum of machinery, the click of tools, the soft tap of data entry on tablets, and the low whistle of coolant pipes nearby. Jax moved through his tasks like a machine himself, his every action economical, efficient, and lacking any trace of emotion. His worn hands, calloused and stained with grease, were the map of his days here, telling stories of countless hours spent within the metal veins of this ship. He was but a cog, that was all. His job was simple: to continue. Not improve, not change. To simply exist and function. Nothing more, nothing less. The low hum of the ship and the silent dance of hands and machines was a lullaby he knew too well, the sad song of a heart in a lonely metal box. Chapter 2: Faulty Generator. The low hum of the Stardust Wanderer, a constant companion since Jax could remember, began to stutter, shifting into a disturbing, irregular thrum. It wasn't the gentle vibration that usually resonated through the deck plating. This was a tremor that rattled the very bones of the ship. A red emergency light flickered on above the door to power substation Gamma, casting harsh, uneven shadows across the metallic floor. Jax, wrench still in hand from his previous check, felt a familiar prickle of annoyance, not worry, settle on his skin. It was always something. He glanced towards Enya, who was calmly securing her tools before moving in the same direction. Elias, on the other hand, practically vibrated with an almost manic energy, his eyes wide behind his safety goggles. "Finally," he exclaimed. "A real problem, not just another calibration check." Jax shot him a tired look, not even bothering to respond. The air in the substation was thick with the smell of ozone and heated metal. Emergency lights struggled to illuminate the cramped space, their erratic beams dancing across the exposed wiring and humming transformers. The central generator, a hulking metal beast, vibrated violently, its usual rhythmic pulse replaced by a chaotic shudder. It felt as if the whole deck would come apart at any given moment. Jax moved towards the control panel, his gloved fingers immediately touching the diagnostic screen, his mind already calculating the most likely issues. Enya moved to his right side, her gaze focused on the multiple warning lights, a faint frown creasing her brow. Elias, full of nervous energy, practically bounced on his heels behind them. "I bet it's the flux capacitor," he stated, half to himself, as he pulled out a scanner from his belt, "or maybe a core meltdown. This is so cool." Jax ignored Elias's theatrical pronouncements, focusing on the readings of the display. His gaze narrowed as he saw a failing regulator, the readings fluctuating wildly. "Regulator 5, he stated flatly, his voice cutting through the loud hum of the generator. "It's about to give out." Enya nodded in agreement, her own hands now resting on a nearby console. "The secondary gauge readings also support this diagnosis. I've been noticing some minor inconsistencies the last few days, but I didn't think they'd go this bad so quickly," she stated, her voice quiet and even. "It's probably just wear and tear. It has been running non-stop." Jax barely registered Enya's words. He had heard it before. Everything wore out eventually. Everything. His mind momentarily wandered to other things and to those who were gone because they also wore out eventually, shaking his head to get rid of those unwelcome thoughts. Elias, however, was practically jumping with eagerness, scanner still in hand. "Wait. I have a modified regulator bypass that will stabilize the power flow without having to swap the whole thing. It's way more efficient." "Efficient is not always reliable," Jax said, already grabbing the tools he needed from his belt. He ignored Elias as he knelt near the faulty regulator. He could feel the vibrations traveling through the thick metal floor and straight to his own bones. Enya placed a hand on Elias's arm, stopping him from interrupting again. "Let's hold on to your new modifications for a moment, son," she said softly, her eyes fixed on Jax's movements. Let's see what Jax makes of it. Jax was already working, the movements ingrained in muscle memory from years of practice. He began to disassemble the casing, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon, navigating the labyrinth of wires and connections. Each click and turn was a tiny adjustment in an ocean of endless, monotonous fixes. Each broken part simply replaced with another one, much like his days. He focused on the small task in front of him, shutting out everything around him. It had become a ritual of sorts. Enya, ever the keen observer, pointed out subtle signs of damage on the internal components. See that hairline crack on the capacitor. That's where the instability is coming from. I could see it was struggling these past days. You just had to observe closely. Her soft voice cut through the chaotic noise of the generator. If we don't replace this soon, it could take out half the deck. Elias bounced on his heels again. He was itching to start tinkering with his new modifications. But Enya, my bypass will reroute the current, creating a much more direct connection to the main power supply, making it at least 20% more efficient. We should try it. Jax didn't even raise his head, already moving to unscrew the last remaining bolt. The bypass systems are not certified, Elias, Jax said flatly, his voice still calm and controlled, not looking up from the regulator he was taking apart. He carefully removed the component, his eyes analyzing the damage in the metal. Elias, however, didn't seem to hear Jax, already starting to connect the modified bypass to the open circuit. He glanced back with a wide smile. I got this. Jax's head shot up. Elias, wait. But it was already too late. As the last connection snapped into place, the generator shuddered violently. The lights flickered, then intensified into a blinding glare, and the hum of the power station turned into a deafening roar, a low growl building up into a metallic scream. The floor vibrated harder as the whole system strained under an unexpected surge of power, its many cables and wires beginning to emit blue sparks. Jax reacted immediately, his movements swift and sure. He lunged forward, and with a hard push, he knocked Elias away from the exposed wiring and pulled him to the side. The air crackled and stank of burnt metal and ozone, thick enough to cut with a knife. What did you do? Enya snapped, her voice uncharacteristically sharp, her usual calm facade momentarily lost in the intensity of the moment. Jax barely registered her words as he swiftly surveyed the console, the display now filled with warnings of overload. He knew he had mere seconds before the generator went completely offline, or worse. He pushed Elias aside and ignored the younger mechanic's surprised expression, and quickly resecured the modified bypass. Then he began reconnecting the old regulator, his hands moving in an expert blur of motion as his mind focused on one simple task, to restore order. Enya observed quietly, a knot of tension in her throat. She moved to secure his tools and keep him protected. Her face was serious. Her usual smile was completely gone, and a deep frown was all she had to offer as she watched her colleague's movements. Jax's muscles tightened as he finally managed to reconnect all the wires and secure the old regulator back in place. A loud shudder rumbled deep within the bowels of the generator. Then, slowly, as if in response to his touch, the chaos started to abate, the roaring screams becoming a more reasonable hum, and then finally, settling into its familiar and predictable thrum. The emergency lights dimmed to their usual steady glow. The harsh metallic stench began to dissipate. The power station was online. The world returned to normal once again. He allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible sigh of relief as he straightened his back, finally looking directly at Elias for the first time since the incident began. Elias, shaken but thankfully unhurt, stood quietly, his modified bypass still clutched in his hands. He stared at Jax with a mixture of shame and awe, his usual confidence gone for the first time. Enya moved closer to Elias and placed a hand on his shoulder. She had always been there to make sure they were safe. "Perhaps, in the future," she said gently, her voice now calm but firm, "we should follow procedure and consult your elders when experimenting with high-powered technology." She glanced at Jax with a knowing look, a silent acknowledgement of his skills and experience. Experience counts more than any fancy new tech. Jax remained silent as he began cleaning his tools, completely ignoring the lesson Enya had just given to Elias, knowing well enough that tomorrow would be another day with more lessons to be learned. A heavy silence lingered in the substation for a brief moment. Jax finally wiped the grease from his gloved hands, his expression unchanged, his body betraying no sign of the tension he just experienced. "We'll need a full diagnostic of all regulators tomorrow morning," he finally said, his voice low but firm. "This should not happen again." He grabbed his canteen and took a long sip of recycled water, the taste metallic and slightly warm as always. Enya handed him a rag to wipe his brow, observing all the subtle signs of exhaustion that he would never recognize in himself. Elias, looking thoroughly humbled, nodded slowly, finally beginning to grasp the lesson of the day. As Jax moved toward the exit, his mind already moving towards his next check, he allowed himself the ghost of a smile as the usual hum of the ship returned to its predictable rhythm, filling the silence once again. Chapter 3. The Intercom. The fluorescent lights of the crew quarters hummed, a dull counterpoint to the deeper thrum of the Stardust Wanderer itself. Jax sat at one of the steel tables, the recycled air thick with the smell of lukewarm synth coffee and stale pastries. Around him, other mechanics stirred, their faces etched with a similar mix of fatigue and quiet resignation. Digital tablets flickered in their hands, displaying maintenance schedules and technical schematics that seemed to never truly change. Elias, perched at the edge of his seat, was already fiddling with a small experimental tool, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Enya sat across from Jax, her hands working a worn patch on her uniform with practiced ease, her movements precise and economical. A low murmur of conversation rippled through the common area, the clinking of mugs and the shuffling of boots creating a low, predictable rhythm. The morning briefing was a ritual, a monotonous dance they performed every day before dispersing into the ship's mechanical bowels. Jax sipped his coffee, the metallic tang doing little to rouse him, his mind still adrift in the half-remembered dreams of a life before the Wanderer. The ship itself felt like a cage, constantly moving but going nowhere, an endless loop of artificial days and nights. Enya's needle punctuated the silence of their table with small, methodical movements, while Elia's fidgeting seemed to resonate with the underlying restlessness that Jax himself tried so hard to suppress. As the digital display on the wall flickered, signaling the start of the briefing, a hush fell over the room. The usual technical reminders droned from the speakers. Jax scanned the maintenance checklist for his sector, Delta on Level 3, the usual humdrum of circuit checks and pressure valve alignments, an itinerary of tedious but necessary tasks that offered no sense of purpose. Elias, though, eagerly started making notes as he examined his new tool. Enya glanced at him briefly, a small sigh escaping her lips, which was immediately punctuated by her ever-present needle. Jax barely registered their actions, his mind still miles away, lost in a fog of past regrets. He had been on the Wanderer for years, and yet it still felt like he was standing still in a world that was constantly moving around him. His old life felt like a ghost that would occasionally come and tug on him in the form of the hum of old machines, the touch of a faded picture, or in those early hours that felt more real than the waking ones. The harsh fluorescent lights of the maintenance crew's common area buzzed in time with the ship's ever-present hum, a rhythm Jax had grown accustomed to, almost as familiar as his own heartbeat. Mugs clinked against the worn metal tables as mechanics began their morning rituals, some hunched over digital tablets, reviewing work orders while others stared blankly at the far wall, already tired before the day had properly begun. The air was thick with the smell of recycled coffee, and a faint, lingering scent of ozone, a reminder of the countless electrical systems humming just beyond the walls. Elias, perched at the edge of the table, was fiddling with an experimental diagnostic tool, its small screen flashing an erratic pattern of colors that seemed out of place within the drabness of their surroundings. Enya, seated opposite him, meticulously stitched a small tear on the seam of her coveralls, her movements precise and economical as if every action was a precious resource to be conserved. Jack sat between them, stirring his lukewarm coffee, watching the liquid swirl without actually seeing it, his thoughts already adrift somewhere between the monotony of his daily grind and the persistent echo of a life left behind. The briefing started with a familiar digital chime, signaling the start of their day, where every system report was delivered with an automated voice that had, by now, become an ignored background noise for most of the crew. Technical reminders about protocol filled the room, most of them well-known and repetitive. Elias straightened up slightly, his eyes lighting up at some of the system updates, his finger twitching over his digital notebook, already envisioning the applications within his experimental tinkering. Enya simply sighed, shaking her head, her focus never leaving the seam she was repairing. Jax took a slow sip of his coffee, the lukewarm bitterness not doing much to chase away his habitual weariness as he continued to observe the two others, one eager, one cautious. Then the ship's intercom crackled to life, and the deep, synthesized baritone of Captain Valerius's voice boomed through the common area, amplified by the room speakers. "Attention, maintenance crew," the voice intoned, each syllable precise, almost robotic. "This is Captain Valerius. It has come to my attention that some areas are showing minor fluctuations regarding power output and scheduled timelines. Your immediate attention is required for a full diagnostic. This ship must adhere to its pre-programmed timetable. Deviations will not be tolerated." The message went into great lengths regarding specific system updates and required changes, all delivered with the same detached and impersonal tone. The words washed over Jax, each one a reminder of their role as nothing more than cogs in a giant machine, devoid of personality, agency, or any genuine human value beyond their work. He suppressed the urge to roll his eyes, his hands tightening around the chipped mug. Enya shot Jax a knowing glance, her expression a mix of empathy and shared resignation, having heard these kind of speeches more times than he could probably remember. Elias was scribbling furiously into his notebook, a wide-eyed expression of eager anticipation that contrasted sharply with the quiet frustration that was beginning to rise within Jax, and the placid look in Enya's expression, now back on the task at hand. The captain continued, his voice an omnipresent drone. "Remember, adherence to schedule is paramount. Any delays will be investigated and dealt with swiftly and without mercy. All changes will be implemented immediately, as directed by the system's tech updates. Any issues must be addressed within the allocated time frame." The conversation in the common area fell to a near-complete silence. Most of the mechanics had heard it before. There was a shared understanding between them, a quiet camaraderie built upon the knowledge that they were simply doing what had to be done, the way it had always been done. None of them showed any signs of expecting something different, some level of acknowledgement, even a single word of encouragement after all these years. All the same, it had, after all, never been in the program of this ship. Jax clenched his jaw, the silence broken only by the muffled clatter of Elias's stylus on his digital notepad, who seemed more determined to focus on the upgrades than on the captain's robotic voice. Enya carefully tucked the needle and thread away, finally looking up and meeting Jax's gaze, her eyes holding an ancient story. "I once heard of a captain," she began in a low voice, "a story she has told many times to countless young ones. Back in the old days of exploration ships, a foolish soul that decided to get creative with his schedules, said they were too rigid and inflexible." She gave a small sigh, her smile never reaching her eyes. It did not end well for him or the crew. Elias's writing slowed for a moment, the stylus hovering above the tablet before going back into full speed. Jax nodded once, understanding without words, while also realizing the implications. He had been on several stations across the sectors, and a captain going rogue was never a good thing. Captain Valerius's voice returned, with an even more sterile tone, as if reminding a flock of unruly drones. "Do not deviate from protocol. Efficiency and strict adherence to schedule is not a request. It is a necessity. Any delays must be reported and explained thoroughly, and the root causes will be dealt with, by the book, no exceptions." The message concluded abruptly, the room suddenly quiet as the voice faded away. There was an echo, however, one of shared isolation, and a profound lack of recognition that permeated the crew quarters. Jax swallowed the last of his coffee, its bitterness now a tangible taste in his mouth, a subtle hint of the bitter truth of his work and their reality. The mechanics began to silently drift away to their respective areas, each one moving with a practiced precision born of years of doing exactly the same. The common area quickly emptied, leaving behind only the persistent hum of the ship and the faint smell of machine oil. Jax tossed his empty mug into a disposal chute, the metallic clank a small punctuation in the pervasive silence. He glanced at the digital work order list, his gaze drifting to Elias, who seemed almost vibrating with energy as he made notes in his notebook, his expression eager and bright in contrast to their shared melancholic state. Jax sighed quietly and turned away. It was just another day. Chapter 4, First Encounter. The shift ended at precisely 17:30. Jax placed the last wrench in its designated slot, the familiar click echoing in the mostly deserted maintenance bay. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and lubricant, a smell he barely registered anymore, so used he was to the artificial reek of the ship. His movements were economical, each action a practiced ritual, a silent counterpoint to the constant, low thrum of the ship's engines. He took one last look at his station, checking, double-checking, then finally turned toward the personnel transition area, a small room where workers could switch from their coveralls into their off-duty attire, a mere few meters away from the crew exit. Some of his fellow mechanics had already left, their voices muffled in the distance, still chatting about the latest engineering theory, while others had simply nodded goodbye, barely acknowledging his existence. As always, Jax barely paid them any mind. He unfastened the clasps of his work suit, the rough material feeling strangely comforting against his skin as he folded the coveralls, and placed it in its assigned compartment, thinking that the material was probably more comfortable than any civilian fabric the passengers would wear in the upper decks, a strange and useless thought that he dismissed as soon as it appeared. The digital clock on the wall read 17:38 as he turned to the corridor leading to the exit. The faint, distant sound of music from the recreation decks barely penetrated the thick metal walls, an unwelcome reminder of the ship's artificial pleasures. He was about to step into the corridor when a figure approached from the opposite direction, from the public access area leading to the recreation decks, her presence as jarring as a rogue signal in a precisely calibrated system. She wore a dress of vibrant colors, a stark contrast to the utilitarian grays and blacks of the maintenance area. It was the diva, he realized, a fleeting image of her having been splashed across the ship's digital signage so often that she felt like a feverish dream. She held a small, heavily stylized bag, its metallic surface catching the dim light. Her expression was a mix of hesitancy and curiosity as she looked around, almost lost, an unnatural sight in such a clearly defined and utilitarian environment. Asterisk, what in the nine hells is she doing down here? Asterisk, Jax pondered as he watched her stop, trying to see if she was looking for a specific place. The thought that she had come here deliberately seemed too outrageous for his rational mind. She held up a small, rectangular tablet, its screen displaying what Jax assumed was the ship's map, an assumption that slowly became less credible as he watched her fail to get her bearings. The question burned in the back of his mind. What would a person like her, someone who should be swimming in luxury and leisure, be doing so deep in the bowels of the ship, so close to the metallic and dull areas that he considered his own private territory? She looked up, her gaze settling on him as she started to speak, almost to herself, though making sure he could clearly hear her. Where exactly is the arbor, Edom, or whatever it's called? Her voice had a strangely condescending, childish tone, which somehow clashed with her exaggeratedly formal clothing, adding a layer of unnatural superficiality to the scene. The way she spoke, with that mix of arrogance and confusion, made Jax feel an unwelcome stab of annoyance, a sensation he hadn't experienced for a long while. Her words hung in the air, their artificial tone echoing off the metal walls, a stark contrast to the low hum of the machines that Jax had come to accept as background noise in his daily existence. He resisted the urge to roll his eyes, a move that felt too expressive for the emotion he felt, and pointed towards a small, almost hidden sign to his right, an area where the recreational zones officially started. The sign read Arboretum Access Level 1A. The area was easily recognizable even for a visitor, had she had taken the time to glance around instead of reading the map, and strangely, a thought crossed his mind. Was she deliberately playing the lost rich girl role? He simply shrugged and continued to stare at her, as if by not engaging she would just vanish as suddenly as she had appeared. "Oh, is that so?" she replied, finally acknowledging his presence after almost a minute of being visibly confused. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed calculated, trying to get a reaction. "I suppose these lower decks are not part of your usual tourist areas, are they?" She smiled, almost knowingly, a gesture that was far too intentional, implying that she already knew the answer to the question, and it was another step into the strange game that she seemed to have set up for Jax. He remained silent, trying to project the apathy that usually characterized his actions, his face blank as he stared at the diva's face, and not her extravagant clothing, a clear attempt from his part to remain focused, though her bright colors were as attention-grabbing as an emergency flare in tea. He middle of the night, especially contrasted with the industrial environment they were both now trapped in. "Do you think I should add them to my social feed? Perhaps the lower depths of paradise or behind the scenes of your daily dreams would work. Perhaps I could get the whole behind the curtains idea and try to get to know the workers." Her tone was dripping with amusement, a mixture of curiosity and something else that Jax couldn't quite place, a mocking quality he felt personally offended by. She was treating him as if he was a pet on display. Jax barely shrugged, turning his attention away from her. "There is not much to see," he mumbled, his voice raspy from disuse. He looked toward the exit and moved towards it, trying to avoid any more unnecessary interaction, but not being fast enough to simply walk out and leave her with no response, aware that not even ignoring her seemed enough of a dismissal. Asterisk, just leave. Why are you wasting your time with this weirdness? Asterisk, his internal voice was telling him, but as much as he wanted to disappear from her sight, a strange curiosity was now stopping his feet, and he couldn't quite figure out why. He had just one thought in mind, to move on to his sterile quarters as soon as possible and to forget the encounter completely. "Oh, I highly disagree," she replied, a small smirk forming on her lips as she approached him with an overly casual gait. She smelled strongly of artificial perfumes, and the cloying sweet scent now filled his nostrils with an overwhelming sensation of unease. Asterisk, it smells like a chemical factory. Asterisk. Jax's internal monologue complained as he tried to move away ever so slightly. "You workers are so fascinating, diligently keeping the ship running while the rest of us." She paused as if searching for the right word, and that hesitation felt staged, an amateurish and overacted pause. "Well, let's just say that we're taking it easy. It must be so fulfilling." Her final word was laced with irony and veiled condescension, an unnatural form of intimacy that felt even more provocative than overt animosity would have been. She was clearly trying to elicit a reaction, a game that Jax had no intention of participating in. But something about her gaze made him feel both watched and exposed, a combination that he had been carefully avoiding for the last few years. "What exactly is your purpose here, keeping all those old pipes and wires in place?" "How charming," she finished, and Jax finally understood what it was that was bothering him so much. She was treating him as a mere curiosity, a small detail in her long and pointless journey, as if she had discovered him and was now dissecting him like some strange bug under a microscope. Chapter 5, Corridor Incident. The hum of the ventilation system vibrated through Jax's boots, a familiar thrum that usually faded into the background of his awareness. Today, it seemed louder, sharper, an almost irritating buzz that mirrored the low-level unease settling in his gut. He was crouched beside a junction box, the cool metal biting against his gloved fingers as he ran a diagnostic check on the relay system. The corridor was a typical mid-shift scene, mechanics scattered along its length, absorbed in their tasks, a few low murmurs of technical jargon drifting in the recycled air. But the usual drone had a discordant undertone, a palpable tension hanging heavy like the recycled air itself. He could feel it more than hear it. Elias, a few meters away, was hunched over a workbench, his brow furrowed in concentration, fiddling with what looked like a miniature turbine. The younger mechanic had been uncharacteristically quiet for the past few days, almost brooding in his silence. Jax noticed the tight set of his shoulders and the way he kept glancing around. Then there was the lingering echo of the diva's words from the other day. It was a subtle yet undeniable sense that the routine was about to change, and the artificial safety was merely a fragile layer that barely hid the ship's inner tensions. Elias straightened up, a wide grin spreading across his face, holding his latest invention aloft like a trophy. "All right then, check this out, fellas," he called, his voice echoing in the corridor's metallic acoustics. He held up a complexly designed module made of polished alloys and clear tubes, its inner components whirring softly. "It's a modification for the ventilation system, something that'll actually work with the ship's structure. No more of that recycled muck." He seemed excited, a vibrant contrast to the surrounding gray and black tones of the metal corridors. Several mechanics turned to look, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to thinly veiled annoyance. Marcus, A grizzled veteran with calloused hands and a perpetually cynical scowl lumbered over, his movements heavy. "What's that bit of shiny junk, kid? Some new toy?" he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the mechanical drone. Elias's smile faltered, but he held his ground. "It's a high-efficiency ventilation module. It can regulate the air circulation better and get rid of those dead spots that the older models fail to reach. Better airflow, better oxygen, better work environment." His voice was a tad nervous but still enthusiastic. He wanted to be recognized for his innovations. Jax could see it. It had been something that he also wished once upon a time. "Ha," Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Better than the systems that have kept this rust bucket in the void for decades. I doubt it. Those old models work. Always have, always will. You young kids always think you can reinvent the wheel." A couple of other mechanics chuckled in agreement, their faces revealing a similar sentiment of dismissal. They had the wisdom of age in their side, and with that, the arrogance that comes from not having made any fatal mistakes as of yet. "But it can be done better," Elias insisted, stepping closer. "It's not about reinventing the wheel, but adding better tires." He held up his module. "It's a brand new system. This new tech works. I've done the tests. It's more effective, more efficient." Marcus leaned in, his face a mask of disapproval. "Effective, efficient. You think that matters in here? What matters is what works and what keeps the damn ship afloat. Your fancy gizmos are more trouble than they're worth. Those pipes are fine as they are. What makes you think you can come in here and just change what is working fine? Working fine is different from good enough." Elias' tone was firm, but his posture was now less confident. "And there's nothing fine about inhaling recycled air. Don't you care about that? What I care about is sticking to the routine that keeps us all alive." Marcus almost spat out those words as he was starting to lose patience. "This is what is expected of us. Why can't you kids get that into your heads?" Jax continued his diagnostic checks, his fingers moving with practiced ease over the wires. He tried to focus on the readings, his eyes glued to the screen in front of him, ignoring the exchange behind his back. But he could feel his old engineering instincts stirring, a part of him that wanted to analyze the efficiency of Elias' module and Marcus's arguments. Still, he tried to ignore both the feelings and the conversation. It was another day, the same argument. These old guys are set in their ways and the young ones have no respect for them. They never learn. He knew this, and all of this felt useless, a waste of energy. He was just another cog making the machine work, as the diva had said. "Respect," Elias almost yelled, his hands balling into fists. "Is that what you guys call respecting the ship? You have no idea what respect means if all you do is keep the same old system, regardless of whether it is actually harmful for us or not. Don't you get smart with me, kid." Marcus's face turned an ugly shade of red as he took a threatening step forward. "We've been working on this heap since before you were even born. You've got no respect for what's been achieved, no respect for the old ways, and you have no respect for the future." Elias almost shouted back at him, stepping up to meet his height. "Future," Marcus laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "There is no future for people like us. We just keep this thing running, and when we die, another kid like you comes in to do the same thing. You're no different, no matter how much you think that new tech of yours will be." Jax heard the chair that was near Marcus scrape against the metal floor, his hands involuntarily clenching a little harder as he registered the anger rising from them both. It was the tone, more than the words. This was starting to get out of hand. "Why are you so afraid to see if new things are worth it?" Elias's voice cracked. "Is that fear, old man?" Marcus lunged forward, his open palm catching Elias across the chest, sending him stumbling back against a support beam. The metallic clang echoed through the corridor, making Jax flinch for a brief moment. Elias' breath was caught in his throat as his head whipped sideways. The younger mechanic gasped and went for a response, but one of the other mechanics quickly grabbed him around the waist before he could do anything more, effectively keeping him back. A hush fell over the corridor. The usual mechanical drone seemed to dim, as all eyes turned to the scene. Jax finally moved from the relay box, the small wrench in his hands clenching hard as if trying to resist from using it. It wasn't like him to react, not these days. He moved swiftly towards them and took a quick scan over Elia's face, checking for injuries. But then his eyes moved to Marcus, who for once was looking down, ashamed of his actions. They connected. It felt like both could see a shared memory of a younger, angrier, more impulsive person. This was followed by a short nod. Nothing more was needed. Chapter 6. A quiet conversation. The midday lull had settled over the crew quarters like a thin blanket of recycled air. Most of the mechanics were hunched over their nutrient paste, forks scraping against the plastic trays in a tired rhythm. A few played a silent game of cards at one of the back tables, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of the overhead lights. The smells of synthetic protein and disinfectant hung in the air, a familiar scent that Jax barely registered anymore. He sat in their usual corner, the same spot by the viewport they always occupied, Enya across from him, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. A comfortable silence had always been the common denominator of their lunch breaks, but today it felt different. Heavier, like the air itself was laden with unspoken words. Enya stirred her meal, a concoction of something vaguely green, with a deliberate slowness that drew his attention. She wasn't eating, not yet anyway. Her eyes, always keen despite the age that etched lines around them, were fixed on him. Not in a way that made him uncomfortable, but more of an intense, quiet observation that he couldn't quite decipher. There was a strange quality about it, a knowing look that made him feel as if his thoughts were written on his skin. It felt disconcerting. Enya placed the utensil down with a quiet clatter, finally letting her eyes wander from his. He could feel an unease in the way his body tensed slightly, but his external reactions were, as usual, imperceptible. "You know," she started, her voice a low rumble that cut through the gentle hum of the room. "I remember when I was about your age, maybe a bit younger, and just starting out as an engineer." She picked up the fork again, now slowly bringing the green paste towards her mouth before lowering it and looking up at him again. "I was fresh off my training module, full of fire, thought I knew everything." A soft smile creased the corners of her eyes, a rare expression of amusement that made Jax sit up slightly to take better notice. "I was assigned to a small transport vessel, hauling cargo to some colony out near the rim, nothing fancy, routine run." She finally took a small bite. Enya chewed slowly, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the viewport. About halfway through the journey, the engine core went into critical failure, alarms blaring, lights flashing red. You know the drill. A faint spark of something, perhaps the long-lost echo of adrenaline, seemed to shimmer in her eyes. My team panicked, and in truth, so did I in the beginning. They were all screaming at each other, pointing fingers, a whole mess. It was absolute chaos. I, being the youngest and the most eager, wanted to show them what I could do, and so, without giving it any real thought, I started dismantling the core myself. My hands moved quickly, driven by a strange mix of fear and adrenaline. She put the fork down again, her voice becoming almost a whisper. I was lucky to avoid being crushed when the containment field gave way, just before I managed to lock the sequence. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if the memories were both painful and exhilarating. It felt amazing, the power, the speed. I fixed it, and the ship kept going. We had all survived. A pause followed her words as she opened her eyes. The playful humor had gone, replaced by an underlying sadness that Jax recognized too well. He waited, knowing that Enya always had a purpose behind her stories. I was proud, so incredibly proud. But in my haste, I had not stopped to understand what my actions could cause. She picked up her fork again, playing with the food as she explained. Turns out the containment field had indeed given way before I started to fix the core, and according to a report I only saw years later, an old friend of mine from engineering college had been trying to reset the alarms on the emergency panel near the core. The failure of the containment had fried him badly. He never recovered. If only I had slowed down to notice his intentions, maybe he would be still alive today. My youthful zeal blinded me back then, and for many years I carried the guilt for this, in silence. She finished, with a sad undertone as she finally took a big bite and chewed pensively. Sometimes, I fear that this feeling will never leave me. Chapter 7, Unauthorized Area. The hum was different here. Not the familiar low thrum of the main engine decks, but a higher-pitched whine, almost like a trapped insect buzzing against a windowpane. Jax adjusted his work lamp, its beam cutting through the dimness of Level 2, Maintenance Sector Gamma. The air tasted stale, thicker somehow, with an undercurrent of dust that tickled his nose. It was late, nearing midnight, the end of his shift, but he was lingering, his usual mechanical precision feeling heavier than normal. He moved through the corridors, the metal grating under his boots reverberating slightly. The walls were dull gray, marked with the scuffs and scratches of decades of use. Here, in the less traveled sections, the ship felt old, its polished facade replaced by the cold reality of its inner workings. The usual rhythmic sounds of maintenance were distant, mostly the soft whirring of fans and the occasional hiss of pneumatic pipes. A faint argument, the rise and fall of voices, carried through the ventilation shafts, sounding like whispers in the vast emptiness. Even though he knew the other shifts were on, tonight he felt a unique sense of solitude, a heavy weight pressing on him. He was alone, and yet he didn't quite feel alone. Jax finished his scheduled checks, his hands moving automatically over the control panel of a coolant regulator. Every movement was rote, a dance he had performed countless times, each time as meaningless as the last. He was about to turn back, to head towards the sterile comfort of his crew quarters, when he noticed something, a small anomaly, a slight flicker in one of the security lights outside of a restricted access point. It was barely perceptible, a momentary dimming that was easily ignored. Usually he wouldn't have given it a second thought, his mind already planning the steps for his next shift. But today, curiosity, a feeling long since dormant, pricked at him. It was a subtle, almost nagging urge. He frowned slightly. He could see it was not a simple maintenance issue. A bulb replacement wouldn't do the trick. His gaze lingered on the door, the metal surface marred with age and disuse. The sign read, Restricted Access Storage Area 7 in faded red lettering, almost a warning. It wasn't his sector, wasn't his job, wasn't his problem. He knew the old storage areas were rarely used, the outdated systems there no longer used or maintained for good reasons. He remembered, almost unconsciously, the diva's face from the other day, her eyes wide, filled with some type of childlike curiosity. His pace slowed slightly as he moved toward the restricted area, his heart beating faster, which annoyed him. This wasn't him. He didn't take these sorts of risks. He reached the door, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the corridor walls. He had worked on similar systems 1,000 times. He ran his hand over the access panel, his fingers finding the release latch easily. A small tool, barely more than a thin metal wire, appeared from his pocket, and seconds later, he disabled the outdated magnetic lock. It clicked softly, the sound seeming louder than it should in the otherwise silent corridor. His inner conflict, the desire to simply ignore and leave clashing with a sudden urge to know what was happening, grew in his chest as he moved the handle. It almost felt like the pull of a celestial body, drawing him toward an unknown and very dangerous course. The hum of the ship was a constant companion, a low thrum that vibrated through Jax's boots as he finished his scheduled checks in Sector Gamma of Level 2. It was late, almost midnight, and the maintenance corridors were mostly empty. His footsteps echoed softly on the metal grating, punctuated by the occasional hiss of a pneumatic pipe, a rhythmic symphony of the ship's silent, tireless heartbeat. He felt a strange restlessness tonight, a tickle of unease that had nothing to do with the systems he was so meticulously maintaining. Even the distant murmur of arguments from other crewmen, usually filtered by the ventilation shafts, seemed more pronounced, carrying a subtle edge of frustration. He mechanically straightened his back, his gaze sweeping across the dim corridor, a practiced habit, yet he found his mind unusually alert, noticing how the shadows seemed to dance in the periphery. The usual feeling of isolation was there, as always, yet a new sense of a strange presence that was not of the ship's hum made his heart thump faster than normal. Jax was already turning to leave, back towards his usual routes, when he noticed that a security light outside the restricted access point flickered erratically. The light, usually a steady blue, pulsed with an irregular glow, casting strange elongated shadows that made the steel walls seem to breathe. It was a minor anomaly, something that should have been flagged by the system, yet a strange curiosity pulled him towards it. The door led to the old storage areas, rarely visited, their automated locks obsolete. He frowned, his usual protocol of ignoring the unusual wavering, giving in to the urge. A flicker of the diva's face came to him, a distant whisper, a faint pull from their previous encounter that made him take another step. This was not his usual path. He stopped in front of the door and felt his hand reach towards it almost by itself. A quick diagnostic confirmed his suspicions. The locking mechanism was outdated and poorly maintained, easily overridden. It would take no effort to breach this door. His mechanical mind engaged, and his fingers moved with the practiced skill of a lifetime of engineering, easily bypassing the lock. The door hissed as it opened, and Jax found himself hesitating. A mixture of apprehension and anticipation washed over him, a feeling he had not experienced for a long time. This was an act of defiance, something completely outside his usual routine. A soft metallic screech came from the other side of the door. It was time to go in. As he stepped through, the air grew thick with the scent of burning wires and old, forgotten tech, an unexpected aroma in the usually sterile ship. In the center of the dimly lit storage room, he found her, the diva, crouched over a complex device. The machine was a mess of circuits and wires, with unfamiliar glowing symbols. It seemed both out of place and strangely intricate. It hummed with a low electrical buzz, emitting faint sparks from a misaligned junction. Piles of cables, spare parts, and half-disassembled gadgets cluttered the floor, a haphazard symphony of discarded materials. She jumped slightly at the sound of his footsteps, turning to look at him with wide eyes that reflected her clear surprise. "You," she gasped, her voice a mixture of alarm and indignation. She scrambled back slightly, away from the complex device that seemed almost alive under its own inner light. Her face seemed pale in the dim light, framed by her brightly colored hair. It was clear she did not expect to be found here this late in the shift. "What are you doing here? This is a restricted area," she exclaimed, her eyes still wide in surprise. Jax remained silent for a moment, trying to make sense of the scene. "And what about you?" he finally asked, his voice low and steady despite the subtle internal shift. "This is not exactly the Arboretum either, is it?" He looked at the tech and added, "And what exactly is *that asterisk? Before she could answer, a series of harsh, mechanical whirs pierced the air. Security bots, their red optical sensors glowing, rounded the corner at the far end of the corridor. They had clearly picked up the unauthorized access, their stun weapons already charged. The diva gasped, her face paling even more, her eyes going wide with an obvious, yet still guarded fear. She tried to hide the device behind her, but there was nowhere to truly escape in the confines of the small room. Jax reacted instinctively, an unexpected surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He grabbed her arm and yanked her behind a stack of heavy crates, shielding her from the bot's immediate line of sight. He felt a surprising protectiveness, a sensation he thought he had buried a long time ago, now awakened by this woman he did not know, as he barely ducked behind the crates as a wave of sparks shot through where he had just been standing. The bots advanced into the room, their movements precise and unwavering. Jax, his mind racing, quickly surveyed their position. He noticed an exposed wire hanging from a junction box on the wall, a quick fix with a small tool in his pocket. He subtly moved the diva behind him, pushing her gently into the darkness as he quickly moved forward. Jax timed his move perfectly. With a swift movement, he reached towards the exposed wires, creating a small but effective electromagnetic pulse. One of the bots froze mid-stride, its systems temporarily disabled, emitting a cloud of sparks. "Go," he muttered to her, his voice low and urgent. "Follow me." He took the lead, his intimate knowledge of the maintenance tunnels coming to the forefront as they plunged into the labyrinthine maze of lower decks. The bots' heavy footsteps echoed behind them, their whirring sounds closing in as they rounded a sharp corner, still on their pursuit. He navigated through narrow passageways and behind heavy machinery, the ship's familiar hum now a frantic backdrop to their escape, his actions both practiced and desperate. He noticed that she moved quickly and with precision, suggesting she might have been running through these parts before. The diva, surprisingly, kept pace, her earlier apprehension replaced by a steely determination. They were both running for something, it seemed. He could feel her breath at his shoulder as she followed, her hands reaching for anything that would keep her from falling over. This was a dance they both knew, a choreographed step-by-step move they were performing together. They reached a secondary maintenance entrance, hidden behind a mountain of old machinery. Jax, his heart still pounding, ducked behind the crates, gesturing for her to follow as he caught his breath. "Wait," he managed, still gasping for air, "they should be lost here." He looked over to her and realized he needed to know more about this woman, but all she did was look at him. He stared back, watching the faint raise in her lips as a small smile formed on her face. There was a mixture of gratitude and curiosity, and another question in her gaze. But before either could say a word, a series of distinct mechanical clicks grew louder and louder just outside the narrow opening to their hiding place. The bots were coming, and this time they sounded like they had more company. Chapter 8: Unforeseen Repairs. The alarm blared, a shrill, discordant note that sliced through the usual hum of the Stardust Wanderer. Red lights pulsed erratically, painting the cramped maintenance corridor in a flickering, lurid glow. The artificial gravity sputtered, a sickening lurch that sent Jax's stomach rising into his chest, forcing him to grab the nearest support strut. He saw Enya and Elias do the same, their faces mirroring his own surprise and immediate concern. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of ozone and hot metal. The usual mechanical heartbeat of the ship felt frantic and unstable now. Here, near the engine access tunnels, the low thrum of the engines was always present, but now it felt like a trapped beast struggling to escape. It was clear something had gone terribly wrong. Jax focused his mind, pushing down the fear. His body became automatic, assessing and reacting. This was not the slow and monotonous rhythm he was accustomed to, but a new beat demanding attention. He felt his usual indifference pushed aside by a sudden and focused urgency. "Report," Enya's voice, usually a calm counterpoint to the ship's mechanical groans, was now sharp with command. She'd already activated her tablet, fingers dancing across the screen as she called for information. Her brow furrowed, a sign of the grave situation. Her eyes darted towards Jax and Elias with a mixture of concern and decisive instruction. Elias, for his part, was vibrating with nervous energy, his hands twitching around the tools at his belt, anxious to get into the action. He clearly felt the shift in the ship's mood and responded with an eager anxiety, but his excitement did not detract from the obvious alarm he felt. "Primary engine access is offline," Enya announced, her voice clipped. "Emergency procedures have isolated the main hub." She looked at Jax. "Manual access through Theta is our only way in." The alarm blared, a discordant shriek that tore through the usual hum of the Stardust Wanderer. Jax felt the artificial gravity falter, his stomach lurching as he instinctively reached out to brace himself against the cool, metallic wall of the maintenance corridor. The scent of ozone intensified, sharp and acrid in the recycled air, a clear sign of electrical malfunction. He looked to Enya, her normally calm face now etched with a rare, serious expression, her movements quick and efficient, issuing short, sharp commands to Elias. Elias, eyes wide with a mixture of adrenaline and apprehension, fumbled with his tool kit, eager to contribute but slightly overwhelmed by the sudden chaos. This was different, far from the monotonous routine they were so used to. "Primary engine access, level 2, section Zeta," Enya barked, her voice tight with urgency. "Looks like a major system failure. Auto safeties are locking down the main access. We go through Theta." The emergency lights pulsed, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them as the artificial gravity continued to fluctuate. Jax, his usual passivity replaced by a focused resolve, nodded sharply. He felt his training kick in, the muscle memory guiding his actions as he quickly assessed the situation. The access tunnel Theta, notoriously cramped and seldom used, was the only way to manually bypass the failed automatic safeties and reach the engine room's critical systems. Enya's instructions were clear and precise. Elias would remain at the entrance to the access tunnel, managing the power and communications while Enya coordinated from the main corridor with a portable diagnostic console. "Jax," she said, her gaze meeting his, "you're going in. Manual override only, no other way, and be quick about it." There was an edge of tension in her voice, a subtle tremor beneath her controlled tone. She trusted him implicitly. It was a responsibility that sat heavy, but also oddly welcome within his chest. It was far more appealing than his usual empty routine. He felt something like purpose for the first time in a long time. Jax didn't hesitate. He grabbed a compact toolkit and a handheld diagnostics unit. He moved with deliberate precision, his body moving like an extension of the ship itself. He navigated the narrow entrance of Theta, descending into the claustrophobic tunnel system. The air grew heavy, the reek of heated metal and lubricant almost overpowering. Sparks occasionally shot from exposed wires. He navigated through a labyrinth of pipes and conduits, his boots slipping on the greasy metal floor. The walls seemed to press in, the space shrinking around him. The hum of the engine grew louder, a thunderous roar that resonated in his chest, yet it was the erratic hissing of the malfunctioning systems that worried him most. He pushed deeper, finally reaching the core conduit, a huge metal tube that ran the length of the tunnel. A significant tear ripped through the outer casing, edges burnt and mangled. The auto repair systems were flickering erratically, spewing out molten sparks. This was more than wear and tear. There was a subtle wrongness to it. Ignoring the showers of sparks around him, Jax moved with a new kind of resolve. His fingers flew across the access panel, his years of experience allowing him to quickly find the manual controls. He worked with focused speed, his mind a cold, efficient machine. He adjusted regulators, rerouted power flows, his movements swift and sure. This was it, the core of the ship. He carefully bypassed the damaged system, feeding the data into the diagnostics unit. After a few long minutes, the sparks subsided, and the erratic power flow stabilized. The diagnostics terminal flashed green, signaling the stabilization of the primary systems. "Primary stabilized, but I can't get a read on the secondary," he spoke into his calm, his voice firm despite the rapid heartbeat thumping in his ears. "It's all manual from here, no automatic feedback." He knew this was a temporary fix. It had simply delayed the inevitable. But now there was more data he could analyze, and he had an idea of what could be behind it. "Understood, Jax. Good work." "Secondary systems remain erratic," Enya responded, her voice still tight with tension but laced with a hint of pride. "We will work with Elias at the entry point and find a suitable temporary workaround. Take your time and come back safely." The communication line cut as the data flooded into the main terminal. Jax emerged from the access tunnel, his coveralls stained with grease and sweat, his face streaked with soot. The emergency lighting still cast long shadows, a reminder of the near catastrophe. Elias stood near Enya, his expression a mix of relief and awe at what had been accomplished in the small, confined tunnel, his usual excited tone now more calm and collected. Jax carefully observed the damaged conduit once more and ran a more detailed diagnostic on his handheld device, a frown deepening on his brow. "It's not fatigue," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the data scrolling across the screen. "They're signs of deliberate tampering, damage beyond any system failure. Someone forced this open from the inside, then bypassed the automatic safety systems." The hum of the ship, though it had almost returned to its previous state, now felt somehow different, no longer just the humdrum noise of existence, but the thrum of an uncertain future. He looked towards Enya and Elias. His usual melancholic gaze had been replaced with something more urgent. His eyes had found their old purpose, a purpose he thought he had lost long ago. Chapter 9. Bridge Interference. The hum was different tonight. A deeper thrum, almost a buzz that vibrated through the metal of the corridor floor and into Jax's bones. It wasn't the familiar, steady pulse of the Stardust Wanderer's engines, more like a discordant note within the grand symphony. He glanced at the diagnostics panel beside the comms junction, the green lights blinking their usual rhythmic patterns, an irritating counterpoint to the unnerving new vibration he could feel, something not quite right, a feeling he had grown used to ignoring. He checked the power levels, then the signal strength, running his hand across the cool metal casing, searching for any reason behind his unease. It was just the extra iors he'd pulled in, the late shift playing tricks on his senses. Nothing more. He reached for his datapad, flipping through the schematics of the ship's communications network, a maze of lines and nodes that sprawled across the screen. He'd been poring over these diagrams for days, trying to find a pattern in the recent generator malfunctions, but the numbers and graphs remained stubbornly opaque. He had almost dismissed his suspicions. Maybe it was just a series of coincidences, old parts wearing down, nothing more. He pushed aside the thought, a familiar dull ache settling behind his eyes. Another night, another set of readings that made no sense. A sharp crackle sliced through the monotonous hum, the ship's intercom sputtering to life. Captain Valerius's voice, usually filtered and booming, sounded raw and strained, a ripple in the otherwise perfectly controlled atmosphere of the Stardust Wanderer. Jax's hands froze over the datapad, his eyes narrowing at the sudden shift. "Engineering, this is the bridge," Valerius' voice broke. "We're experiencing fluctuations in the engine management system. Confirm source and implement emergency protocols immediately." The usual calm was absent, replaced with a hint of panic he had never heard before. The captain never broke protocol. The captain was never emotional. Jax's breath hitched, a strange prickle of dread rising up his spine. This was not good. He placed the datapad on the nearby shelf and started to recheck the panels. As he moved his head, another sound broke into the silence. A high-pitched giggle, distorted and childish, echoing from the intercom, followed by a mocking drawl. "Oh, Captain, are you having trouble keeping your ship together? It seems your old methods are a little broken." The voice was vaguely familiar, a jarring, inappropriate sound in the sterile environment of the maintenance levels, far too similar to another voice he had recently encountered. The captain tried to respond, but the giggle erupted once more, this time followed by another comment. "Maybe a new direction is what we need, a little change. What do you say, Captain? Shall we explore new horizons for all?" The mocking was constant and relentless. A shiver ran down Jax's spine. The diva. It had to be her. He placed his hand on the comms panel, the cool metal against his skin a strangely grounding sensation, as he tried to make sense of what he was listening to. Somehow she had gained access to the ship's communication network, a feat as impressive as it was terrifying, manipulating the controls with alarming skill. The giggling came back again, this time closer than before, as she seemingly enjoyed her disruptive game. The dim corridor, outside the bridge's communication junction, hummed with the familiar thrum of the Stardust Wanderer's systems. But tonight, an unsettling undercurrent vibrated through the metal floor. Jax adjusted his worn gloves, the calloused leather familiar against his skin, and ran another diagnostic on the comms panel. The readings were fluctuating erratically, a pattern he'd noticed since the faulty generator incident. Each blip and static burst sent a prickle of unease down his spine, a sensation he usually suppressed with practiced indifference. Yet tonight, the usual melancholy that clung to him felt less like a heavy blanket and more like a flimsy veil. He was aware. He was listening. He was not just existing, he was feeling. He reached out and adjusted a dial, the cool metal sending a shiver up his arm. It was a simple task, one of many in his nightly routine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, unsettlingly wrong. It was more than just a system malfunction. It felt like an intrusion, an unwelcome shift in the established order of his world, of his ship. A sudden crackle ripped through the silence, the intercom sputtering to life with Captain Valerius's voice, usually so composed and filtered. It was raw, laced with a palpable strain that sent Jax's senses into overdrive. The captain's usually robotic tone was replaced by something that sounded almost panicky, a stark contrast that did nothing to ease Jax's anxiety. Engineering, bridge to engineering, were experiencing unexpected fluctuations in the engine management system. Diagnostics are reporting multiple feedback loops. I repeat, multiple. The captain's words were interrupted by a static buzz and a strained sigh, quickly followed by a heavy curse word in a language Jax didn't recognize. Something very unlike Captain Valerius. Then, a moment later, the comms went silent again. Jax's brow furrowed. This was not a typical malfunction. His eyes scanned the console, and he was able to see that all readings regarding the engine system were indeed chaotic, but there were no visible faults that could explain the severity of the issues. Just as Jax was about to investigate further, the intercom crackled back to life, but it wasn't Captain Valerius's voice. This time, a distorted, childish giggle echoed through the corridor, bouncing off the metal walls, followed by a series of mocking, almost sing-song comments. "Oh, dear Captain," the voice trilled, a mocking tone cutting through the sterile air. "Are those feedback loops causing you trouble? You sound rather flustered." Jax's hand tightened into a fist, clenching against the metallic edge of the panel. This was not right. This was a deliberate taunt. He recognized that voice immediately. The diva. His eyes narrowed, a knot forming in his stomach. The hum he'd noticed earlier wasn't the usual vibration of machinery. It was a faint, almost imperceptible buzzing, the telltale signature of hidden technology. It was now clear. She had found her way into the ship's communication system somehow, and seemed to have a complete understanding of the bridge and their ongoing situation, which led Jax to believe that her presence near the communication junction was not a mere coincidence. "It appears our dear captain is having difficulty," she continued, her voice dripping with a condescending tone, now amplified through the ship's entire comms network. "Perhaps a different approach is in order. After all, why stick to the same old route when there are so many new horizons out there for all of us, wouldn't you say?" There was a pause, filled with static, as if the diva was contemplating something. "Oh, I forgot. You wouldn't know a thing about it up there on the bridge, would you, dear Captain?" Jax's mind raced as he watched the chaos unfold on his screen. It was no coincidence that the exact same malfunction he had experienced during the faulty generator repair was repeating itself now, in real time, and the diva's voice over the comms seemed to have something to do with it. The readings indicated a familiar cascade of system failures, eerily reminiscent of what he'd witnessed before in the power substation, almost like it was being intentionally replicated, but with an added interference he could not immediately determine. He cross-referenced the technical schematics, his hands flying across the console, a stark contrast to his usual methodical pace, as he now realized that these were not malfunctions at all, and the diva knew it too. She was toying with them all. She was causing the ship to act erratically, and seemingly with no other purpose than for pure entertainment. The diva's voice broke through the analytical fog, her tone changing to a more conspiratorial whisper. "Wouldn't you agree that a slight course correction is in order?" The static hissed again, followed by a giggle. "For all of us." This seemingly throwaway comment delivered with such childish glee was the key to her entire plan, a change in route. Jax could no longer ignore the ramifications of that sentence. This was no longer just a comms interference. She was trying to change the ship's course. His heart pounded, a foreign sensation in his usually quiet existence. A flicker of fear, but also a strange sense of urgency, ignited in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a deep, almost primal need to protect the ship, to preserve the delicate balance that, until now, he had only taken for granted. It wasn't just about the ship, he realized. It was about everyone aboard, crew and passengers alike, adrift and unaware of the forces being thrown at them. Jax suddenly felt that all those isolated routines and detached thoughts were not only meaningless, they were potentially dangerous. He needed to do something, anything, to stop this, to prevent something far more terrible from happening. He made a sudden, decisive move, ignoring the years of routine and protocol. His hand hovered over the main communication switch, the power that controls all communication to and from the bridge. He had always been told to keep it on, no matter the circumstance, but his intuition screamed against that rule now. It was risky, isolating the bridge completely, cutting off communications, not only to the diva but to the rest of the ship. But if he had correctly interpreted the diva's game, this would, at least, stop her from interfering with the engine systems, if only for a short period of time, which would allow for a moment of respite for those in control. Jax's hand was still for a second, and he felt himself breathing in deeply, as if bracing for an impact that he knew was coming. He then pushed the switch down with a swift, controlled motion. The The humming of the panel died, replaced by a heavy, unnerving silence that settled around him. The dim lights of the corridor seemed to cast longer, deeper shadows now, and the metallic hum of the ship became a background murmur in the sudden quiet of the comms junction, where the only sound was the heavy pounding of his heart against his ribs. Jack stood there, his gloved hands resting on the silent console, a strange mixture of apprehension and purpose washing over him. He was aware that his actions were reckless and illogical. He had never actively intervened with ship systems like this before. Routine was his safety blanket, and today that blanket was no more. Today was different for him and for everyone aboard the Stardust Wanderer. He was now very certain of that. He swallowed hard. He'd never been one to challenge the status quo. He preferred the rhythm of his routines. Yet here he was, taking a stand against the invisible forces that were changing the course of not only the ship but, maybe, his own life as well. He could not shake off the feeling that, for the first time in a very long time, the choices he was making were finally relevant. Not because they followed some old protocol, but because they had a definite impact on everyone aboard this colossal ship, including himself. And that was terrifying and exciting all at the same time. The silence was now heavier than ever. The silence was deafening. The silence was ominous. Chapter 10. The Revelation. The air in the lower deck storage room, Section 4, hung thick and stale, a concoction of old lubricants and rarely used cleaning solutions. It was a space forgotten by most, a place where the ship seemed to exhale its discarded secrets. Jax's helmet lamp sliced through the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with the movement of his head, making the stacks of forgotten tech and equipment look like restless giants. Just inside the doorway, the diva fiddled with a section of wall paneling, her gloved hands moving with a focused precision that seemed at odds with her previous careless behavior. Jax watched her, his unease a knot in his stomach that felt as heavy as the metal grates under his boots. He'd followed her, that odd magnetic pull of curiosity he thought had died with his old life bringing him to this rarely accessed part of the ship. It seemed she had entered the storage room easily enough, and yet her actions were both hurried and frantic, like someone trying to hide something from prying eyes. Or, he thought with a sudden rush of adrenaline, someone that knew prying eyes were already on them. He moved closer, the gentle whir of his boots barely audible against the ship's low hum. The diva gave no reaction, not even when he moved into view. He watched, silent, as her fingers found a concealed seam in the wall paneling, a hidden compartment that popped open with a soft click. Inside, he could see neatly stacked crates, each one filled with components that made his skin prickle with recognition. They were modified versions of the same tech he'd seen Elias tinkering with, parts that were integral to the ship's core systems. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat resonating with the growing certainty that his unease was more than justified. These weren't simple replacements or old pieces of discarded material. They were something else entirely, something far more sinister. He took a step forward, the sound of his heavy boots echoing through the enclosed space, finally breaking the silence that seemed to grip them both. "What is this?" he asked, his voice a low growl. He hadn't even realized he could still sound so angry. The diva finally looked up, her eyes flashing in the harsh glare of Jax's helmet lamp. She was not in the least concerned that he'd found her out. "Just a harmless hobby," she said, her voice laced with a dismissive nonchalance, a clear mask over whatever her real intentions were. It sounded completely unconvincing to both of them, Jax knew. You wouldn't understand. Her attempts at deflecting were weak, not even a proper attempt, more like a challenge. Jax didn't miss the flicker of agitation that passed through her eyes, that single, almost imperceptible micro-movement that confirmed that he had indeed stumbled upon something she did not want anyone to know about. He approached, his gaze locked on the open compartment. "These are system components," he said, his voice even but laced with a barely contained tension. He pointed to one of the crates, his hand trembling slightly with a strange mix of frustration and dread. "Modified system components. The kind that you shouldn't have, not here." She threw him a condescending look that made Jax want to shut down his systems and simply walk away. He stayed put. "You see what you want to see, mechanic," she retorted. "You're too blind to see the true realities, focused only on the here and now, but never looking at the big picture." Jax ignored the comment, instead reaching forward, picking up a component, examining it closely. It had a similar make, yet felt different. The energy it exuded was familiar, and yet not. The metallic taste of ozone and lubricant that lingered in his senses started to turn into a metallic taste of blood and anticipation, making him feel suddenly hyper-aware of everything. He pushed the component back inside the crate. He would look at them later, analyze them. First, he needed to understand what exactly was happening. "This tech, it's been altered. Why?" he asked, his tone growing darker, more challenging. She didn't answer at first, just watched him with an intensity that made him want to recoil. The arrogance he had seen in the previous encounters was replaced with an underlying, almost savage determination. She moved closer, almost looming, her eyes glinting with an emotion Jax couldn't quite decipher. "Because," she began, her voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper, "the systems, your safe systems, they only work for some, not all." She punctuated her statement with a harsh look. "Do you think it's fair that some travel in luxury while others struggle to keep this whole thing from falling apart?" She looked directly at him, her eyes like burning coals, seeking an answer that Jax did not have. "Do you think all of this is safe for all the souls within this metal coffin?" She paused for a moment, letting her words hang in the air like a poisonous cloud. "You're part of the system, mechanic." "But I'm not." Jax didn't reply, his mind racing with the implications of her words, linking the modified tech to the recent anomalies and also to Elias's endless attempts to fix everything. This wasn't just about faulty systems. It was about someone actively manipulating the ship itself. Or trying to, anyway. He ran through the events of the previous week, and a cold realization took shape. The faulty generator, the communication problems, the sabotage in Access Tunnel Theta, they were all connected. Every single one of them was, in fact, deliberate. He could sense in her eyes that this was bigger than a game, that her motivation was deeply tied into something that Jax had previously dismissed, social disparities. He turned to face her directly. "And what do you think you're doing? Making things better? How is this better?" He asked, gesturing to the open crate, a sense of growing frustration creeping into his voice. "You're putting everyone in danger, including yourself." "Danger," she chuckled, a hollow sound that sent shivers down Jax's spine. "You're all already in danger, mechanic, and it's not my fault. I'm merely trying to rebalance the scales." She looked straight at Jax, and all humor left her face as she moved closer to him, a dark resolve in her eyes. "You think your job is simply to make things safe, but are you truly making them safe for everyone, or just for the select few?" She moved closer, and Jax finally realized he was a trapped bird with a predator right beside him, making no move towards him. "Your entire job, your entire purpose here is to keep this machine going. But you must see now this machine. It has its own purpose, and its purposes are not for all that reside within it." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jax asked, but his mind was still catching up. A million images of systems and schematics were flashing in his mind. What was her objective? Was she intending on crashing the whole ship? He wanted answers and, strangely, wanted to keep this machine going more than anything else. "You want everything safe, mechanic." she spat out as if the word was a poison in her own mouth. Well, safe is subjective, and my safe is different than yours. The diva raised her hand pointing towards Jax. You think that the systems here are a given, that these corridors and metal grates are safe for everyone. You know more about the inner workings of this ship than most, yet you ignore the deeper currents within it. Why is that? She looked down on her hand as if it was dirty, before tucking it in by her side and focusing her eyes back into his. You have been working here for too long to be still this naive, mechanic. She smiled then, a cold, almost bitter smile that didn't reach her eyes. This isn't about the components themselves. It's about... She was cut short by a sudden, piercing shriek that echoed through the storage room, immediately followed by a cascade of alerts from Jax's comm unit. It was a rapid succession of sounds that he hadn't heard before, a new signal he could not quite place. He could feel in his own bones that something had gone horribly wrong, and the diva stood motionless, with her words left hanging unfinished in the air. Chapter 11, Under Pressure. The shift began like a broken record, a frantic energy thrumming through maintenance hub Gamma. Gone was the methodical hum, replaced by a cacophony of alarms and the urgent chatter of system errors flooding the comm channels. Jax felt the tension tightening in his chest as he took in the scene. Mechanics clustered around flashing crew monitors, each display screaming of a different impending failure. The air was thick with the acrid bite of ozone, mingling with the metallic tang of burnt plastic. He registered the nervous twitch of Elias's fingers and the grim line of Ennia's mouth. Even the most seasoned crew members moved with a newfound urgency that he couldn't ignore. Deep within, the familiar fear crept up as he tried to take a deep breath, a futile attempt to ground himself. This wasn't just a hiccup. The ship felt like it was coming apart at the seams, each alarm echoing his past trauma, a reminder of things he'd tried so hard to forget. He needed a focus, a place to begin, anything to quiet the internal scream building within his mind. The ship-wide systems were collapsing, dominoes falling in a rapid chain of failures. Maintenance teams scattered like seeds on the wind, each desperately tasked to contain a critical failure. The digital maps showed multiple hotspots, flickering indicators in all the lower sectors, which had become the central point of the sabotage, he suspected, which only added another layer of frustration. Jax knew he wouldn't get any specific instructions. Everything had to be solved immediately and with the resources they had available. Ennia, eyes narrowed in focus, barked a few instructions at Elias, sending him towards central comms and their overloaded systems. Jax saw the slight tremor in her hand as she pressed a data pad onto him, directing him towards the lower deck's primary access points, an area notorious for its cramped and dangerous pathways, his heart sinking at the prospect of having to navigate those spaces in the current circumstances. But her voice was calm, steady, an anchor amidst the tempest, and Jax understood that this was something he had to do, even with the faint echoes of his past whispering doubts and insecurities. "Go, now," she commanded, and he found himself already moving as she reached out and briefly touched his shoulder with an almost motherly tenderness, a moment of concern which he simply brushed past as he began the long journey into the ship's labyrinth. Jax descended into the chaotic maze of the lower decks, the familiar hum of the ship's core vibrating up through his boots. Each step was heavy, almost reluctant. Emergency lights flickered erratically, painting the metal walls in strobing hues of red and orange, the sense of a full-blown alert palpable. He ignored the discomforting buzzes of faulty conduits and broken junction boxes, his mind focused on the task ahead. He moved with the mechanical precision honed over years of routine, though each step now felt purposeful. The air was thicker down here, heavy with the stench of burnt insulation and ozone. Wires sparked, throwing off a shower of embers that illuminated the cramped passages. He kept the datapad open, constantly scanning the diagnostics as he located each critical system, muttering the codes he remembered with ease, while simultaneously checking the stability of each area. Each fault was more complex than the last, and a clear thought was echoing within his mind. Somebody was doing this deliberately, and they were getting better at it, adding a dangerous thrill that forced him to move faster, focusing on each problem with a clear sense of action, and his heart pounding in his chest like a second engine. He began to direct the mechanics within his sector, his voice surprisingly steady. He saw Marcus struggling with a power regulator in Section Beta, and quickly allocated 2 other mechanics to secure the surrounding areas, before telling Marcus to release the faulty component so that he could secure a secondary line. He knew that working with more traditional mechanics was no easy task, but they also understood, like he did, that this was a necessary task that couldn't wait for protocol or even for permission. They responded quickly, silently, almost surprised by the decisiveness in his actions. He noticed the hesitant looks of a younger mechanic struggling to reconfigure an overloaded circuit, and showed him the proper connections, knowing, deep down, that the crew relied on him in this area. The crew was becoming a cohesive unit, each moving efficiently in a well-oiled operation, with Jax in the middle, and their trust seemed to form with every correct connection. It was an odd feeling. He could almost feel the ship breathing, relying on his actions, his competence, something he hadn't felt since he was still working as a true engineer, back before the quiet isolation. And despite the urgency and the danger, it was something he almost missed. He continued to navigate, passing through the familiar and now damaged pathways. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last red light faded, replaced by a steady green. The emergency klaxons ceased their piercing wail, replaced by a lower hum of machinery. His body sagged with exhaustion, but his mind was buzzing with a strange sense of accomplishment, a strange and new type of purpose he'd almost forgotten about, and the sensation left him feeling more tired than before. He wiped grease from his brow, his gloved fingers leaving a streak across his forehead. The smell of ozone had lessened, replaced with a comforting scent of lubricant, an almost welcomed smell after the recent troubles. He was alone in the dimly lit corridor now, the emergency lights reduced to a gentle pulse, echoing his still unsteady pulse. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a short breath before thinking about the next area, which he now had to fix in a matter of minutes. His exhaustion was a heavy blanket, but his thoughts were clear for the first time that day. Around him, the other mechanics had finally managed to regain some kind of stability, most of them going through their own diagnostics, silently communicating in hand signals and quick nods, their movements more fluid. Enya approached him, her face still lined with worry, but her eyes also held a spark of something else, pride, perhaps, or just quiet relief. She reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder with a brief, familiar gesture, communicating 1,000 things without ever saying a word. A brief moment to acknowledge they were both on the same page. She simply nodded, and he knew that his rest would be very brief. Just as a small sense of relief began to settle, Captain Valerius's booming voice filled the corridor, a filtered, artificial sound cutting through the relative quiet. "Maintenance teams, this is Captain Valerius," the voice echoed, laced with a combination of gratitude and an unsettling authority. "I require a full report regarding the system's failures. Meet me in the main tunnel's hub at your earliest convenience and make it quick." The communication cut out, leaving an uneasy silence in its wake. Jax felt the familiar tension return, a sense of apprehension knotting his stomach as he turned to Enya, and she, once again, seemed to know exactly what was going through his mind as her gentle expression hardened slightly. The brief respite was over, and another challenge waited just around the corner. Chapter 12. A Bold Idea. The main tunnel's hub, Section Beta, felt more like a forgotten battlefield than a strategic command center. Emergency lights flickered erratically, casting long, dancing shadows across the exhausted faces of the mechanics. The air hung heavy with the acrid scent of ozone and burnt metal, a stark reminder of the previous night's chaos. Jack stood amidst the chaos, a beacon of quiet focus in the swirling uncertainty, his hands splayed across a workbench covered with hastily drawn schematics and digital diagrams. Enya leaned against a nearby metal support, her eyes fixed on Jack's, her expression a mixture of worry and seasoned appraisal. Elias, fidgeting with a datapad, hovered near the edge of the group, a restless energy barely contained within him. The diva, in stark contrast to the crew, stood detached against a steel pillar, observing everything with a knowing look. Her presence felt like an intrusion, an unsettling reminder of the chaos she had helped to unleash, even if it was with a hidden agenda. "All right," Jax began, his voice low but steady, cutting through the murmuring of the crew. He gestured towards the schematics. "This is what I've come up with." He traced a finger along a line of complex symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The primary engine access is still offline, but we can reroute the power flow by tapping into the auxiliary conduits on level 2. It's risky, but it's our best option." A murmur rippled through the small gathering, a mix of apprehension and weary hope. Marcus, a gruff mechanic with grease-stained hands, grumbled, "Rerouting, that's never been done before. It's too unstable." Elias nodded quickly, a spark of nervous enthusiasm in his eyes. "But that's how the new system should operate. We can enhance the flow." "And I've got a couple of new ideas I'd like to." Enya raised a hand, silencing him. "We are not adding new elements now, Elias. We need a solution that is stable and can be done quickly. We do not have the time for more experimenting. Tell us more, Jax." Jax acknowledged Enya's gentle interjection with a subtle nod. "Enya is right," he stated before gesturing to a different part of the blueprint. "We'll have to use the auxiliary systems, yes, but I think there is enough margin for us to be able to adapt, and perhaps even compensate for the current system's failings. The main issue is that those access points have been inactive for, well, since I started working here at least, so it might require us to move fast. And where does her little project come in?" Marcus added, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he gestured towards the diva. A few mechanics muttered in agreement. The diva pushed herself off the pillar and crossed her arms. "My tech isn't a toy to be used whenever you feel like it, grease monkey," she said, her eyes glinting with an annoyed sparkle but with a strange form of underlying amusement. "But it's not going to stay hidden when you guys are about to fry like leftover burgers if I don't play along." Jax intervened before the argument could escalate. "Her components can be repurposed to stabilize the power surge while the main system is being bypassed. It's an unconventional approach, but necessary." Another murmuring wave started from the group, mostly of doubt, but a small number looked hopeful. Jax tried to look at all of them to meet their gazes with understanding, but a heavy sense of his past resurfaced, with the feeling that his words seemed insufficient to the task ahead. His hands became clammy, and his throat felt dry. Enya stepped forward, her voice calm yet firm, silencing the room. "We've all reached a crossroads, my friends. We either do as we always have and await our impending doom, or we embrace something new that has just been presented to us. Jax's plan makes sense. It is risky, but there are no other options. He is not asking for your undying trust. He is asking you to have faith in what is possible if we trust one another." She looked at each of the crew, her face a mask of firm resolve, and then looked directly at Jax. She nodded with a hint of something that looked like hope. I, for one, believe it is our only option, and I also have faith in Jax. Jax felt his heart give a small jump in his chest as he listened to Enya's unexpected words of support. He could never have predicted it, even after having worked alongside her for what felt like forever. His initial unease gave way to a surge of purpose and self-assurance as she, again, gave him the strength he desperately craved. In his mind, an image surfaced unbidden, his wife's kind face from a lifetime ago, her soft smile reminding him of the familiar feeling of working towards a higher purpose. A pang of grief hit him, and for a moment the world seemed to slip away to another reality, and yet he was still standing in front of his crew, stronger and more determined than he had ever felt. He blinked, and they were still there, expectant, worried, hopeful. The diva seemed surprised by Enya's defense. Her eyebrows rose, a barely visible smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. For a moment, Jax noticed a flicker of something akin to gratitude in her eyes, but then it disappeared behind her usual facade of cool indifference. "Well then, if the old lady has spoken, who am I to object?" she declared with her usual mix of sarcasm and indifference. But this time the group heard that as a form of a reluctant acceptance and a first step toward teamwork. "But let's not make it into a grand, heroic act. I will not tolerate another corny motivational speech." Elias, fueled by the renewed energy in the room, stepped closer to the diagrams, his eyes scanning every detail. "If we modify the energy regulators," he began, his voice picking up speed, "we could also use those extra couplings on the secondary grid." He started to mark details on the schematic, his initial worry replaced by an eager determination. Jax watched him for a moment, and noticed his quickness and precision was finally applied into a cohesive and grounded matter, a spark of pride blossoming on his face. He also saw that he was finally going through the change that Enya had hinted at. Jax gave a small nod to Enya as he heard the new, improved version of Elia's eager voice, and she smiled back, her eyes twinkling with a proud wisdom. "Let's get to work," Jax declared, his voice echoing in the vast hall. The emergency lights seemed to flicker in response, casting a glow of quiet determination over the newly united team. It was not a silent acknowledgement of the task ahead, but one of purpose. This new path, even with its obvious dangers, felt right. Chapter 13. The Culmination. The engine room control was a maelstrom of activity, a symphony of clanging metal and hissing steam, punctuated by the urgent thrum of overloaded circuits. Red lights pulsed like a frantic heartbeat against the cold steel walls, and the air tasted of ozone and burnt lubricant. Jax moved with a focused intensity, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a calm authority as he guided the team. Enya's voice, steady and calm, cut through the chaos, directing Elias to reroute auxiliary power lines, her words precise and purposeful. Even the security officers, usually so aloof, moved with a newfound purpose, their presence an unspoken acknowledgement of the severity of the situation. Yet beneath the flurry of mechanical fixes, there was an undeniable undercurrent of panic, a sense that the edge of the abyss was closer than it had ever been. Jax moved with practiced ease and intent, but his hands showed his inner turmoil as the worked the controls with an expertise that seemed foreign to the man of routine of the past few weeks. The plan, audacious as it was, began to take shape. Jax's deep understanding of the ship's infrastructure, honed by years of monotonous work, was now the key to averting a full-scale system failure. He worked quickly and with purpose, weaving through the maze of exposed wires and sparking conduits. Elias, once impulsive, now moved with calculated precision, his earlier attempts at bravado replaced by a determined efficiency. deftly reconnecting damaged cables while Enya offered calm guidance. "Steady hand, Elias. Feel the flow," she instructed, her voice a low hum amidst the chaos. "Like blood through the arteries now, make it sing, and don't you break your rhythm." He smiled, and for the first time he felt that he actually understood what Enya meant with her peculiar ways of expressing herself. His usual smile was now one of quiet confidence and capability. Each completed circuit, every successful bypass, was a tiny victory against the chaos that threatened to engulf them all. The engine room was a symphony of controlled chaos, a frantic ballet of wrenching metal, hissing steam, and the urgent blare of klaxons. Jax moved through it like a conductor, his eyes scanning the readings, his hands adjusting valves with a precision born of years of practice, yet a new sense of purpose gave each movement a different meaning. The air hung thick with the smell of ozone and overheated metal, and the deck vibrated with the barely contained power of the ship's massive engines. Enya stood nearby, a steady presence amidst the flurry, her voice a calming influence as she provided the essential data he needed. Elias darted between systems, his initial nervousness replaced by a focused determination as he reconfigured power couplings. The ship itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, almost as if hoping the problems might end. Jax tightened a bolt, the metallic click echoing in the otherwise frantic din, his thoughts crystal clear for the first time in a long while, no longer haunted by ghosts of the past. But the weight of responsibility was now upon his shoulders, a much more bearable burden than before. "Enya, reroute auxiliary power to conduits 7 and 9. Elias, check the stability of the bypass on the primary regulator. Now." His words, though calm, carried an authority that was new to him, but also came naturally as a result of the confidence he now felt. The three of them worked in perfect sync, moving with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine, years of collective experience and the will to keep the machine running, pushing them all forward. He felt the thrum of the ship beneath his feet, no longer as something to just maintain, but as a living entity they needed to protect. His purpose was now clear. He needed to ensure the Wanderer did not stop, no matter what. Suddenly, Captain Valerius's voice boomed over the comms, the distortion and the pressure in their voice creating an additional layer of tension. "Report. What is the status of the engine systems? I want immediate answers from the lower decks." There was a sense of controlled fury underlying those words, a clear reminder of how this was a transgression of protocols. Jax took a deep breath before answering, his eyes never leaving the panels. "Captain, we are rerouting power to the primary regulator using auxiliary conduits. Systems are stabilizing, but there was indeed tampering. This is no accident." He paused. "And we need a course correction." Enya nodded slowly, understanding the severity of the situation. There was a short pause, then Valerius' voice, now a touch less distorted as they focused on the information at hand. "A course correction. Explain yourself. Are we deviating from protocol?" The diva, her face illuminated by the glow of her portable console, spoke up, her voice clear through the open comms channel. "The system shows an uncharted stellar object, on a collision course. The current trajectory will not be sustainable." She sounded calm, almost detached as she added, "I suggest an immediate change of trajectory before we all turn into cosmic dust." Jax could sense the shift in the comms tone, a feeling of helplessness. "We're ready to upload the data for the course correction, Captain. We need authorization now." The diva was ready, her fingers flying across the console, her focus unwavering as she kept glancing towards Jax, looking to see his intentions. The silence hung in the air for a moment, and it felt to Jax that his entire past was rushing through his head. The wife, the child, the work, the monotonous days, everything felt both too far and so incredibly near. Yet there was nothing that he would change in all the steps he took to be in this very moment in control and focus, determined to do the only thing he could now do, lead. Jax knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the main control panel, all the steps now coming to focus, and his hands, those old, battered hands, now had something concrete to hold. "Upload the data," Jax said, not to Valerius but to the diva herself, and she did, as a gesture of good faith that they could both be something more than they currently were. "Captain, prepare for the new route," his words resonated, now with a quiet certainty as he felt the control of his fate once again resting in his hands. Valerius hesitated. This is unprecedented. Are you certain this is the right decision?" There was now a subtle hint of humanity in his voice, almost an acknowledgement of the lower deck's position. "We don't have a choice, Captain," Enya said with a rare sense of urgency. "It's either this, or we all become one with the stars, and not in a romantic way. Trust us." A mix of gratitude, relief, and finally respect was obvious, even within the robotic static. "Do it. I am authorizing the new route. May the stars be with you." Jax watched as the new course coordinates appeared on the main screen, a complex series of numbers and symbols that represented their future. The ship groaned, a low, guttural sound as the massive engines adjusted to the new path, shifting their direction into the unknown. He finally felt something he had not felt in years, the rush of life pulsing within his own being, for perhaps the first time since the moment he had decided to walk the solitary path. He finally had a purpose, a responsibility to protect others as if they were his own, not by choice, but by duty. The hum of the ship had changed. It was not that melancholic lullaby of solitude, but something entirely new, and yet it sounded perfect for him. He turned to face his crew, to face Enya's gentle and encouraging smile, to see Elia's beaming with energy and pride, and even to face the ever inscrutable, but now somehow relatable diva, for he realized that each of them had been essential in their own way, that each action had a direct correlate. twAIn to the man he had become in this crucial moment, the man he would be from now on. "It is done," Jax declared, and the room slowly began to fall into a calming silence, even though the ship was now on a path nobody had predicted. He knew he was no longer adrift. He had found his place in the system.